Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite was Joseph. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were working in the fields. Joseph's brothers resented him, and when they saw him coming, they attacked him and threw him in a well. Then they sold their brother as a slave, took off his coat, soaked it in goat's blood, and showed it to their father, tricking him into believing a wild animal had killed Joseph. Soon after, Joseph was sold to a military official in Egypt as a servant. God helped Joseph do great work, and the official was very happy with him. Joseph was very handsome, and the official's wife tried day after day to seduce him. One day, she pressured Joseph so much that he ran out of the house, leaving his coat behind. She told everyone that he tried to force himself on her. The official was furious and threw Joseph in jail. God once again helped Joseph in all he did. And eventually, he was put in charge of all the prisoners, helping run the jail. Joseph had the special ability to interpret people's dreams. One day, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, asked Joseph to interpret one of his dreams. He dreamed that 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows, and 7 heads of healthy grain were eaten up by 7 heads of dried up grain. God helped Joseph interpret the dream. Egypt would experience 7 years of successful farming, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was impressed and put Joseph second in charge of Egypt. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food. When they got there, they met with Joseph, but didn't recognize him right away. When Joseph finally told them who he was, they wept because they were sorry for what they had done. Eventually, they went and got their father Jacob and brought him back to Egypt. Joseph took care of his entire family, giving them property in the best part of the land where they lived for the rest of their lives.
Okay. We're getting a mic issue, so.
How about now? All right. All right. Well, I had the opportunity to go to my father's 90th birthday party. It was an incredible experience with us all converging on our farm in Iowa. They still live in the over 100-year-old farmhouse that my father's grandfather built. So, and we stayed at a little house across the road where I grew up and was born and raised, and we actually slept in the bedroom where I slept as a little kid. And I always believed that there were monsters in that room. And I told my wife, yeah, I remember. I always thought there was a monster hiding under the bed. And she's like, better be careful. And that did it. I was up all night. It's totally messed with me. Anyway, you have quite a task this morning, so do I. Out of all of the stories in the Bible, this story about Joseph in week 3 of our journey through the whole story of the Bible is a story in which we will watch the interplay of this lower story where you and I live and the upper story of what God is doing. And what is amazing in this story of Joseph is that Joseph got it. And I just want to say at the outset that it's very important that you're able to understand and grasp the interplay of your lower story with the faith that God is doing something in the upper story, or you'll miss everything that God has for you. So this is kind of a hard lesson for us today. Someone asked me, why are you wearing a tie? The last associate pastor we had asked, how do I decide on a Sunday morning whether to wear a tie? And I told him I'm either cold or I'm feeling insecure. So today I was a little chilly, so I'm wearing a tie today. So we want to look at this incredible model for us of this two-story interplay that God is working with us. We've seen how God exists, how he's created us. We've plummeted into sin. There was no way that we could get ourselves out of this mess, even though as you live and walk with people and study world religions, people are still trying to get themselves out of this mess. But we know from the Bible that we can't. So God takes the initiative to get us out of this mess, and he has chosen to do that through a people that he creates. He chooses Abraham. God founds, if you would, the nation of Israel, tells Abraham to go to this land, promises him land, enormous people, and a blessing, and that they will be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. So our first principle is that in each of our lives, like the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there's this lower story where you and I live. That's what you're dealing with today. It's our lives. It's our jobs. It's trying to get your homework done on time. It's the, dating and mating and trying to start a family. It's having kids and dealing with blown out diapers. Yes, I know what those are. That's life. It's trying to make a living. It's trying to pay your bills. Sometimes it's wondering where God is in the middle of all of that, but that's this lower story. But we're learning in these story that in each of our lives, there's also this upper story where God is working and God reveals himself through the scriptures. And sometimes he reveals to you what he's up to through the Bible passage you're reading or through someone else speaking into your life. This is what God might be doing in your life, and you and I need to recognize that. And so I don't want you to miss that. I just beg you, you can't miss that. If you miss that, you'll be chasing your tail in life, trying to fill your tank with joy through possessions, through materialism, through sex or drugs, or trying to achieve the American dream, or you're going to try and fill that hole in your life with something. You'll be doing that. If you miss this dual story thing, you'll be a person who knows enough about Christianity that you'll become bitter at God, because you're going to see the junks that's going down here where you and I live, and you're not going to make sense of that. You'll have no faith to believe that there's a God who loves you and is doing something in the upper story. So you'll get bitter at God. You'll hang it. You'll quit church. You'll quit faith. But there'll be this ache inside, trying to figure this all out. The story explains it for us. So, second principle, faith is believing that God is up to something good in our lives, circumstances to the contrary. So in your lower story, you got stuff going on. But as a person of faith, you have to develop this ability to believe that God is up to something in your life, and that something is good. Joseph's story is going to teach us that. And it's not just like a story in the Bible. Joseph's story and the flow of the intermingling of upper and lower story is your story. Just like God was involved in his life, God is up to something in our lives. And there's no story that explains this better than the story of Joseph. You might want to write this down. Hebrews 11:6 says, and without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. So that's like if you're like watching baseball right now, that's like base 1, Christianity 101. You have to begin by believing that God is, and that he'll reward those who seek him. That's us. So it's faith that trusts that God is up to something good in the upper story. He's unfolding this plan to get us back. He started with this old guy named Abraham, makes promises to him. It's passed on to miraculous birth of Isaac. And the new nation starts, and then he reveals himself that we can't get back on our own. We've sinned against him. We're stuck. We need God to guide us to this blessing of God to get us back. That red thread, if you would, is going to chase itself all the way through the Old Testament and the New Testament and lead you right into the arms of Jesus. So, who's Joseph? How does that fit in? Well, Joseph's dad was Isaac, and his father, or Jacob, and his father was Isaac, and his great-grandfather was Abraham, so he fits in this lineage. He was 17 years old when we pick up the story, and he has 10 brothers, and they don't like him. They don't like him. There's 2 reasons. One, his father Jacob showed favoritism, and he liked Joseph the best. So he made this fancy-dancy coat of many colors for that son, and everybody else got jealous. So you need to learn from that. It's a bad idea. Favoritism wrecks families. There's a second reason that got him in trouble with his brothers. Joseph had dreams. And the gist of these dreams was that his older brothers were going to bow down to him, bowing down. Word to the wise, if you have dreams like this, don't tell your siblings. Generally, older siblings do not want to hear about how they're going to bow down to you. They don't like that. So one day, Joseph's dad sends him out to his brothers, and they see him coming. They have all this hatred built up. They're like, let's take this guy out. They want to kill him. But they decide they're going to sell him to the Ishmaelites who were in a band traveling by. And they bought him. And so they got to tell some story to Jacob. So they take the coat of many colors and they drench it in blood of an animal, and they go back to their dad and they go, oh, some wild beast must have got our beloved brother. Of course, his father is ripped to the core, and they're done with Jacob. This is one dysfunctional family, which should be encouraging in one respect, because if God can use this family with all the crap they've got going on, God can use you and me. See, somehow in the church you get this idea that everybody's supposed to be shiny. You get your act together. At least you walk in the doors with like your act together, and then you're one of us. Well, we may have an elder meeting over this, but I just want to go on record saying we're all like messed up, okay? And we all need Jesus. And so if you're messed up, join the crowd, become part of our church. Because we can't do this alone, and we need Jesus, okay? We need God's unfolding story in order to make sense out of life and our own life. But I'm very encouraged that with all this junk going on, God's like, still going to use you guys. Still going to use you. And so he gets sold as a slave. He is a slave to the captain of Pharaoh's guard named Potiphar. And at this formative time in his life, he's deeply wounded by what has happened to him. But something else is going on. We read up here in the upper story in Genesis 39:2, and the Lord was with Joseph, so he prospered. See, God wants you to know you're not just winging this. He's involved in your life. The Lord was with Joseph. So even though God allowed his brothers to abuse him and sell him as a slave, God was with them. He was with Joseph. This is a big clue to us that in the life of Joseph, there was, in fact, an upper story unfolding along with the lower story. And that leads me to my third principle. God's providence is constantly with us, guiding our lives. This is God's overarching rule in our lives, accomplishing his purposes. It's a big word, but it's a good word. It means that God cares. He's involved, and he is accomplishing his will in your life. Psalm 139:7, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings in the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. He's there. And he's not just like yawning. He's actively at work. So with God's help, he allows Joseph to quickly rise, and he gets put in charge of Potiphar's house. But then another tragic bombshell happens. In Genesis 39:6, we read that Joseph was well-built and handsome. Now that used to be on my bucket list. Moving on. Potiphar's wife takes notice of Joseph, and she tries to seduce him. Joseph, however, does the right thing, and he refuses her. And just as, a 30-second aside, no extra charge for this one. It's a little bit off topic, but here it comes. Notice that his power to resist her was not from some inner macho strength that Joseph had. What he possessed was a greater pleasure in God, a pleasure greater than the sexual pleasure of adultery. Genesis 39:9. He says, Joseph says, who is greater in this house than I am? Nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You would think he would have said, and sin against your husband. But see, there was something inside of his life, a driving principle, driving his character and his decision, that had a greater pleasure in God than in the lust of the flesh. Okay, back on track. So Potiphar's wife had to settle for framing Joseph. She lied and said that he tried to go after her, and her husband believes him and puts Joseph in prison. And his life is like a seesaw, up and down. But then we read again in the upper story, a little glimpse, Genesis 39:20. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was there with him. So God is up to something. Some commentators I read said that Potiphar probably knew a little bit more about his wife than we think so, because in that culture, this charge against Joseph would have, in any other situation, produced instant death. Instant death penalty. You mess with the captain of the guard of Pharaoh himself, mess with his wife, you are a dead man. But for some reason, he puts him in prison. You need to think about that. Next, God is always there sustaining us. He showed favor to Pharaoh. He granted him kindness in the eyes of the prison warden. We see again, God has allowed this attack on Joseph's character, but God's now raising him up. He's like the head dude in the prison now. You know, this is amazing. God is cultivating the character of Joseph. God's not sitting there, by the way, in your life going, oh, all this junk happened. Oh, that's a real bummer. No. God is using everything that's happening in your life, some of the most painful things that are happening in your life right now. He's shaping the man. He's shaping the woman, just like he was shaping Joseph in prison for his purposes and for his glory. He is sustaining you. Lamentations 3:22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Steadfast love, it's very interesting. It's one Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is chesed. But it's impossible for us in English to translate that with just one word. There's too much in it. The steadfast love of the Lord that's abounding. If a person was a Hebrew and read that word, chesed, they would know instantly about this God and his character. You and I need to be schooled in the steadfast love of the Lord for you and I. He will sustain us. This is why Psalm 55:22 can tell us, cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be removed. So God in prison gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. He shares his dreams with two prisoners who are there. And what's happened to those two prisoners was exactly what Joseph said they were. The one guy was raised up, the other guy was hanged. And Joseph's like, please remember me when you come before Pharaoh. And the Bible says they forgot him. Have you ever had like your hopes like, okay, I'm getting the upper story now. I'm hanging on. God's involved. He's going to do something. And then he doesn't do what you think he should do. And the Bible says he remained in prison 2 years. These are 2 more years before the cook is listening to Pharaoh's dream that he can't figure out. And he's like, or the cupbearer, and he's like, cupbearer goes, oh yeah, there's a guy in prison. He can interpret dreams. You need to develop a tenacity of faith to hang on to the Lord's working in the upper story. Because if you sit here in the lower story of your life and circumstances and you try and slice and dice that and figure it out, you're going to become a very discouraged man or woman. You have to trust the Lord. Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. The problem with us is we always want to see it. We get it all figured out, and then we go, yeah, I want to believe in the Lord. And it's like, well, that's not really faith, because you can see it all. You can know the answers before it ever happened. It's like your grandma, you're praying, for faith to trust God for finances, and your grandma leaves you, $80 million, and you're like, oh, I'm really wanting to trust the Lord for money. And you've got $80 million in the bank because your grandma left it for her, but you're like in church going, we need to pray and trust the Lord for finances. That's not faith. Faith is things in your life that you cannot see. They're things that you're hoping for that are unseen. And you are abandoning your trust to God. Like, for example, the Christian faith. I've never seen Jesus personally. I've never been to heaven. I believe in both. We'll have communion soon, and we'll be pronouncing that those who trust in Christ, their sins are forgiven. How do I know that? See, God has made certain promises to you and I. Look at me, and you have to choose whether you are going to believe what God has said to be true. And God made a promise to Abraham that Isaac knew. And Jacob knew that promise that was made to Abraham and Isaac. And Joseph knew that same promise, and he's hanging on to it even in prison. So he comes to Pharaoh. Genesis 41:14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. They shaved him and changed his clothes. Must be kind of grimy in a prison. They got him all ready. He said, interpret my dream. Joseph said, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So already he's learning humility. He's learning in his life to trust the upper story that God is going to work in. He's not even heard the dream yet, but he's trusting that God is working in this upper story. Pharaoh's like, can you do this? And he's like, I can't, but God will. And then he proceeds to tell him. It's going to be 7 years, bumper crop, 7 years, horrible famine. Explains his dream and the interpretation of it perfectly. And Pharaoh's like, you're a pretty wise guy. I'm going to put you second to me over all Egypt. Secretary of Agriculture and kind of a mini Pharaoh. Nobody's going to do anything without your say. So he stores up all these crops. 7 years of good, and then 7 years of famine start to unfold, and everybody's crops die. They can't plant, they can't harvest. So people are starting to come to Egypt. It wasn't just Egypt that had this. This was a big area-wide famine. And they're coming, they're buying grain. Pharaoh's getting rich. They're selling first their money, then they give Pharaoh their belongings, and then they sell themselves as slaves. This was an incredible plan that Joseph unfolded. Guess what? God's people are about to starve to death in Palestine because the famine's there too. And so they decide, Jacob's like, why are you standing around here looking at me? He actually says that. Take some gifts and go to Egypt and get us some food so we don't die. So they show up in Egypt. They don't recognize Joseph, but he recognizes them. You know the first thing that they do when they see this person that they don't know, but they know he's a bigwig? They all bow down, fulfilling the dream that he had. And you know what he does? He lines them all up and has them all killed. No. The Bible tells us he forgave them. 22 years of his life had been wasted, and he forgives them. There is no way that anyone could do that unless they understood that what's happening in my life is being guided and superintended by the upper story of God. See, that's what's going to save you from bitterness. You're going to choose to believe that even in the mess that I am in, God is in it. God can bring good from it. God is all over this. God, I am in with you. I am trusting it. Joseph captured the upper story. He understood. In Genesis 45, verse 3, we see Joseph tell his brothers, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Leads us to next principle. God, in his providence, uses everything in your life to accomplish his purposes. Genesis 45:4, so Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Now, if you're tired, listen to this. "Do not distress yourselves, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land 2 years, and there's yet 5 more years in which there'll be neither plowing or harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth." God uses everything in our lives. This is the upper story. The truth of grasping what God's up to is just like crystallized in Genesis 50, verse 20. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." You know what this means? God is going to use every single thing in your life and weave it into the tapestry of his will. In fact, I believe he'll use our disobedience and evil to accomplish his will, and we'll miss his blessings. But if we submit to him, he'll use our faithfulness like Joseph, and we'll be incredibly blessed. But nobody can tweak God's nose. God is sovereign over all things, and he's using all things for his glory, and he's using all things in your life for your good. Can we submit to that, church? Can we bow before the Lord and say, like Joseph, "I want to trust you. You are developing my faith. You are providing for me." God provided for the preservation of this nation, from whom this nation that could have perished in Palestine, but God kept them alive because, in fact, Jesus was going to come through that bloodline. Joseph yielded to God all of what was happening to him because he believed God was up to something. Now, there's an application for you. We need to yield what's happening in our lives right now. Yield. Big yield sign. It seems to me focusing on God and and believing that he's up to something, rather than focusing on the lower story circumstances, is what helped Joseph to lift his eyes to see God and his plan. And you and I can do that as well. Finally, full devotion to God involves giving our lives over to God in the upper story of his will. You and I are to learn that full devotion to God involves yielding what's happening now. Let him mold and shape your character in the midst of trials, fiery trials, on the anvil of his will. Let him shape you. And God blessed him. We read in Genesis 50 that he lived a full life to 110 and was able to hold his grandkids on his knees. He trusted that God was up to good. Paul the Apostle says something similar in Romans 8:28. "For we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." That is a verse of faith, believing in the upper story working in my life. It's a very painful verse to say that in a time of death or cancer or trial, that God's doing that. But we live in both worlds, where we're at right now, and we have to believe that God is involved in this upper story. As I finish, you want to come? I'll have the worship team get set up for me here. Give you your stool back. That might be helpful. So you might be here today thinking your life is over. This story is telling you the exact opposite. God is at work in your life. This is not how it ends for you. You might be in prison right now. You might be listening to this message and you might be in jail. But emotionally, you might be in a prison right now. And God is telling you this is not how it ends for you. God is at work in your life right now. And he's going to work his sovereign will out in your life, we must let him. You are to have your hope renewed. You are to see Joseph's story and go, oh, God is at work in my life. I must surrender my will to his will in my life. God not only wants you back, he wants to use you like he used Joseph to minister to other people. Not in spite of everything you've been through, listen carefully, but precisely because of everything you've been through. Will you bow with me? God, I pray in Jesus' name that you might come and invade our thoughts and our hearts right now, that you might use this message to help us to embrace by faith the upper story of you being involved in our lives, just like Joseph's. And you want to use us. You want to heal us. You want to strengthen us and build our faith to trust that you, the living God, are at work in our lives for good, to bring ashes from our defeat, to bring purpose where we see nothing. Help us to submit to you. In Jesus' precious name, amen.